Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our latest productivity talk, organized by the Asian Productivity Organization, where we feature guests who do interesting work at the nexus of policy, production, and technology in Asia and beyond. This is Polchait Kraparyun, and I'm with the Digital Programs and Information Unit, as well as the Public Sector Unit of the APO. With the mounting urgency of the climate crisis and increased activism and public attention on social issues, there have been accelerating regulatory requirements in the finance industry. Sustainable finance and ESG has risen to become part of the investment mainstream in recent years. Finance is key when it comes to accelerating the energy transition to a low-carbon economy, as well as supporting a range of social goals. The promise of ESG and sustainable investment is to align the financial industry with the social and environmental good. Our speaker today, however, has made the provocative statement that ESG does not exist. To perhaps elaborate on this and to share his general perspective in this fast-moving area, we have Dr. Kim Schumacher joining us. He's a lecturer in sustainable finance and ESG at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. He's also an honorary research associate at the University of Oxford, as well as an adjunct lecturer at the University of Luxembourg and the United Nations University. His work focuses on ESG data and impact metrics, sustainable finance frameworks, green bonds, natural capital, biodiversity, and ecosystem services, as well as renewable energy project development. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Schumacher.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and I'm honored to be presenting some of my views today, which you mentioned, some of them were a bit more on the provocative side, but I'm very much looking forward to provide a little bit of context to these comments. So, to start off, first after your kind introduction, so I first want to talk a bit about where I'm coming from and a little bit of my background. And then afterwards, after a Q&A, I also want to look a bit at the global sustainable finance and ESG trends. And that will provide some insights into why I came to some of the conclusions that you already elaborated on. And then finally, I also want to provide some more regional context of what is happening in Asia, and particularly because I am at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, also in Japan more specifically. So so first, if you allow me to, I will share a little bit of my professional track record and where I'm coming from. And it is a bit of an unusual track record, as people will likely see, but it also shows the complexity of sustainable finance. And it also pertains to some of the issues that I feel need to be addressed in the future to make this entire sustainable finance activities or to make sustainable finance activities more resilient and actually also live up to their name. So I first I am originally from Luxembourg, and I first started off by studying law, which might come as a surprise to some of you. So by studying law, I was very interested in what is happening inside of the EU, and especially transboundary policy. And that was one of the key elements that I wanted to explore. So I first started off studying in France, then with stints in Germany and the then still UK, EU, still the UK, which still belonged to the EU at that time. And afterwards, I had the privilege to be able to be selected as a Fulbright scholar to go to Berkeley in California, UC Berkeley. And that is where I started studying, really digging and delving deeper into environmental aspects by studying environmental and clean technology law. And that was also at that time where I became very inspired by two separate incidents. One was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power accident, which was caused by an earthquake and by a tsunami. And that was something where I really felt I want to explore more how can a country such so industrialized such as Japan deal with basically the loss of 1/3 of its electricity capacity overnight. And the second one was while at Berkeley, I participated in an interdisciplinary class by the now Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, who was then the former governor of Michigan and who was one of the lecturers at UC Berkeley. And her class really inspired me. And she was also one of very kind people who constantly wrote letters of recommendations for me. So she was really someone who fostered also my career in sustainable finance and everything related to sustainability. So those two events really catalyzed where I wanted to go in the future. But I wanted to enroll, I wanted to explore more the natural science side of things. But with a background in law, that was not necessarily evident. So I wanted to start a PhD at the University of Tokyo in Japan because I wanted to explore and investigate firsthand in Japan how would the country deal with, an important loss, which was the loss of its nuclear power capacities, almost overnight. But since I came from a more social science law background, and I had to take an entrance exam. So basically, I had to go back and basically catch up on all my undergraduate natural science in order to pass the entrance exam. So fortunately, I did. And then afterwards, I explored environmental impact assessment related issues around large-scale renewable energy installations. And how would Japan, for example, deal with the integration of such volatile sources, renewable sources like wind and solar? And could the electricity grid actually cope with such a heavy input? And that was something that I explored much further. Then also, in order to still maintain a firm grasp on interdisciplinarity and also transboundary elements in my research, I did also visiting research at the University of Cambridge and in Harvard, which I always felt privileged that I had the opportunity to go there, thanks to generous funding from the university and also from scholarship organizations. So, and then after graduating, finishing my PhD, I want to say, I also want to be very candid. I did apply to a lot of places, and a lot of times I was not necessarily successful in getting a postdoc. And but with perseverance, I was able to get a postdoctoral research position. And that is also where I'm saying sometimes, it never hurts to apply. Of course, we all know that relationships and connections and established relationships can be important in terms of securing certain career or advancing in your career. But for example, for Oxford, I didn't know anyone. I just applied out of the blue. And to be quite candid, in the beginning, I thought my interview went horrible. And in the end, I felt sometimes you have a good feeling about something. I had a bad feeling about it. And I still was selected. So that is why I'm saying sometimes perseverance or so can also get you to it, to the goal that you want to achieve. And in Oxford, that is where I first time came really in contact with sustainable finance on a much more deep level, because of course environmental impact assessment always revolves around projects and also project finance, but here it was really a much larger or a much more broad exposure to the topic. And that is also where I explored things like green bonds, sustainable funds, non-financial disclosure, things like that I will now also try to explain a little bit deeper and a little bit further also in this session. And the thing is, by doing so, by exploring that, I also found out that, for example, Luxembourg tries to become a green hub. And with those, being originally from Luxembourg, some things led to another. And that also led me to and my connection to Japan, try to maintain these connections, having one leg in Asia and one leg in Europe, or even with my Berkeley, with my former Berkeley studies also in the United States. So really this transdisciplinary aspect became apparent because climate change and biodiversity are global issues. So in terms of how can we make the finance sector and the banking sectors more sustainable became really a core element of my research. And while at Oxford, part of my research was also funded by the European Investment Bank on green fixed income securities, like green bonds, as they're also known. So one thing really led to another. And then there was the opportunity. So I'm also going to be quite honest. So after I'm an EU citizen, being from Luxembourg, but after Brexit, there were quite a few challenges in terms of for researchers. in the UK, and especially how to think about the future with the trajectory of the UK at that time being very that there was very little certainty for researchers as well. So that is when an opportunity came along, and I had the opportunity to go back to Japan at the Tokyo Institute of Technology and also help develop like sustainable finance activities, which did not really exist prior to my arrival. So that has been a great experience, and it's also great to see like how well sustainable finance has been received in terms of training and capacity building, and now it is also gaining a very strong it's gaining a strong foothold in Asia and in Japan. So I'm sure that these activities will also expand in the future. And then finally, to wrap it up with my personal trajectory is so I'm by saying that science needs to always adhere to the highest standard, but it also needs to not only exist in a theoretical space where solutions also need to be of a practical nature, and you need to implement them and make them tangible for other stakeholder groups, especially in the finance and in the banking sectors and the corporate sectors, where sometimes certain theories or certain concepts are not necessarily applicable to real life situations. So that is why I also have been heavily involved with different industry groups, but also standard setting groups and other policy think tanks and international organizations, in order to maintain that link and also have science inform, for example, international frameworks, guidelines, and standards, but also have it to be as applied as possible. So to not dilute science, but also make it, workable in terms of in professional settings, in practitioner level settings. So that was very important. So as you can see, I've been involved with the CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the Climate Bonds Initiative, the International Standards Organization, the Global Reporting Initiative, and very recently, I've also have become the main science and sustainability advisor for the largest bank in Luxembourg. Because again, I also, due to these exchanges, I also learn as a scientist, how can research inform business practices, but also on the other hand, how do we as researchers need to explore certain elements of how business can use our concepts and our data and our research in a more practical way. So yeah, that was it from me. So I'm now looking very much forward to to have some questions asked or so around what it means, because again, this was a very unusual track record, and to hear a little bit other opinions of what it means and perspectives, that would be very interesting. So I'm looking forward to that. Sorry, I have one last slide that I missed.
Sure, please go ahead.
ESG, but it is just E stands for environmental, S stands for social, and G stands for governance. And E, we associate it with environmental issues like climate change and biodiversity, ecosystems. S with social standards, gender equality is a large part. Then we also labor standards. And then G is usually how do we address corruption and mismanagement at the corporate and the board levels. So those are basically just the main points that fall into E, S, and G. And these are now factors that should be considered when making investment decisions, or just should be considered in the finance and the banking communities whenever making decisions or managing risks. So, and another one is greenwashing is a main issue that I also am very involved in. So I do a lot of different analyses around this. So these are just a few examples of my track record that I've researched. So around standards, around macroeconomic impacts, and around ESG data. So I just wanted to present these, that I do a lot of research around greenwashing, ESG data, the impact of ESG integration on economic performance. So, and with that, I would hand it back to the APO secretary to hear a little bit what they feel my track record brings to the table, and maybe also have some questions around for practitioners in general.
Great. Thank you for sharing with us your background and kind of the story of what drew you to ESG, sustainable finance, and environmental issues more generally. You mentioned, of course, that you had background in law, which you said was a bit unusual, and then later on became more expert at the maybe natural science side, environmental science side. So do you still consider yourself as having kind of like, what hat do you see yourself as primarily wearing? That, like the scientist hat or kind of the legal hat?
I think so. I would say that I'm sort of in between, because now what we see is like with governments nowadays, a lot of decisions need to be informed by science. I think the COVID pandemic has been a very good example of how crucial and how instrumental it is to be informed by science. And we also saw like some negative examples. I think everyone knows some negative examples where what can happen if we do not listen to science. And again, I also want to know, and I've also been very honest about that. Science is also always a dialogue. Like science is like, for example, if I publish an article and I submit it to a reputable journal that has a solid peer review process, that means that my article sometimes is examined also by people who are not necessarily in my discipline. So I also get feedback from researchers who are, for example, in other social sciences like sociology, or in other natural sciences like physics, or like things like that. So that means that science always has different angles. So it's difficult to say what hat I have. I know there's always a lot of compartmentalization happening because we like categories. It makes life easier. But the problem is with science nowadays, and especially with sustainable finance, it becomes increasingly interdisciplinary. So that makes it sometimes hard to qualify, but still a lot of even the academic world is structured around these disciplinary denominations of is someone social science or natural science. And of course, I also do not want to say that someone who studied I don't know, law, and then takes a quick online course on ESG is automatically a natural science expert or climate science expert. That is not the case. I want to be very clear about that. We should not dilute the value of genuine subject matter expertise. But on the other hand, how do I say, science in the future will probably become much more interdisciplinary. And in terms of law will probably become more informed also by more data driven, because what we see is law previously was a lot on emotional factors, and often the role of science has been downplayed. Unfortunately, recently there were always in the world where for example large elections or so, we saw the dilution or the role of science downplayed. But on the other hand, I think now with sustainable finance, there's always this word science-based that will pop up more and more. And science-based also means that the role of science will probably become more prominent, because if we think about climate change, or if we think about biodiversity, sea level rise, things like that, there is pretty much a consensus around it. So science, it's always a debate, but around some things like climate change or degradation of ecosystems, there's such an overwhelming consensus that through decades of research, we are now basically come to the conclusion that some effects, especially human-made impacts, are just a reality. And luckily, most of the world's politicians have acknowledged that. So we will probably see more of this interconnection. And that is where I would say I'm basically in both categories, to answer your question. I see myself still strongly connected to the law, but also I'm in my own research, I'm heavily applying natural science-based principles, like for example, in terms of data, in terms of methodologies, and also in just my own research, in terms of, for example, modeling the risks to forest ecosystems, things like that. So I think it's good to have these types of track records who are sometimes a little bit in both areas or in both who land a little bit in both categories. But on the other hand, it's not everyone, but I think in the future, just the exchange between both groups will increase. So, and in the future, probably some of these how do I say it, strict delimitations will probably sort of disappear gradually to sort of where people are not fully social science or law or policy, and also not fully natural science. And probably we will see sort of a new category emerge that is sort of strongly based in at the intersection of those two.
Great. And I think that is why it's so great to have you here today to talk to us about ESG and sustainable finance, because just like your background, it's something that involves natural sciences, involves law, it involves economics. So I think it makes you kind of the perfect person to talk us through some of these issues. I have a few other questions about kind of, since you sit on so many different, you're involved in so many different institutions, standard boards, you're an advisor to a bank, as well as obviously you're being part of various research institutions across 3 different continents. I'd like to ask you a few questions about culture, but maybe we'll get to that in the next segment for question and answer. So please go ahead and we can start learning about ESG and sustainable finance.
Yes, and I will try to keep this segment also short and crisp, because it is just the underlying tenet of this section is basically just sustainable finance and ESG investing have been exploding in terms of size and in terms of just momentum, gaining momentum, immense momentum in recent years. And that is something that we will outline. But first we will need to understand a little bit more. Before I said we have ESG, this term environmental, social, and governance. But why are we even thinking? Why are we even talking about that? Because not only have we, with the Paris Agreement and with the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations, which has established the Sustainable Development Goals, really sustainability and climate change have literally have come to the forefront and are not going away anymore. So there's pretty much a global understanding of those concepts. But what is important to know is that what we call the double materiality concept. So why should businesses and the finance sector even care about these things? And before it was mostly reputational, but now we see that climate and environmental issues have a direct impact on the company's business activities and on financial portfolios. So in terms of managing risks, because for example, if you have a hotel chain where all the hotels are near the sea, and with sea level rise, that can pose a concrete threat to that. Or for example, if you operate very carbon intensive activities and governments decide to establish carbon taxes, significant carbon taxes, that could mean that some of your business operations are not economically viable anymore. So it represents a risk. And that is as we can see, the primary audience would be investors. But then also on the other hand, and that is where the double materiality aspect comes in, is a company's activities and a financial portfolio, so finance institutions who fund or provide capital or invest in certain companies or activities, these activities have a concrete impact on climate and on the environment. So it can become a negative feedback loop because if a financial institution, if companies engage in highly environmentally detrimental activities and make the situation worse, then also at the same time, the risks to the companies themselves and to the environment and to financial portfolios might increase at the same time. So both of these are connected and both of these need to be considered. So this double materiality angle is becoming more and more and one of the main concepts around sustainable finance, that we need to both manage the risks and the impacts that our activities, be it corporates, companies, or financial institutions, have on the climate and the environment. And then we get to how can we manage these risks? Or how can we basically start implementing these ESG strategies, like environmental, social, and governance factors? So there's different investment strategies. And we have, for example, best in class, where we look for those who perform particularly well. For example, in terms of board representation, female board representation, or for example, carbon reductions, engagement and voting, engaging with companies and using their shareholder rights in order to vote for more sustainable company management. Then ESG integration, like looking at different factors around, for example, biodiversity, water consumption, but also respect of labor rights, things like that. We look at those. Then we have exclusions where we just exclude certain sectors straight away, be it fossil fuels, gambling, alcohol, or weapons. Then inclusions is where we just want to have certain categories included mandatorily. That can be, for example, renewable energy, or that can, for example, be vegan food can be one of the things. So meatless products. So those are things that can be included. Then we have impact investing, where we want to basically see a concrete result of our investing. Whereas with ESG integration, it would more be like we're trying and we're considering ESG factors, but we are not necessarily waiting for the results to be there in order to act. Whereas with impact investing, the results are have a much higher weight than just trying the input. The output with impact investing is much more important than necessarily the input, which is more important with ESG integration. And then we have norms-based screening and sustainability-themed screening. So that basically means we look at different norms, for example, human rights, or we look at, for example, sustainability themed would be, for example, women empowerment could be one of the things, or female education could be another thing. So these are different investment strategies in order to foster sustainability. And here we just see how it has been exploding and where most of the money has been flowing. So exclusions have been gotten the major chunk of the investing, of ESG investing or sustainable investing. And then ESG integration has also been growing very quickly. And as we see on the other hand, impact investing, because impact investing is waiting for concrete results, it is much more time intensive and resource intensive. And that is why it has seen comparatively lower inflows than, for example, negative and exclusionary screening or ESG integration. And here's just how it has been expanding. But what we also see, it has been expanding very quickly in Europe, in North America, and even in Australia or New Zealand. And in Asia, it has also been growing, but in terms of share, it is still comparatively low. In this case, also for Japan. So there's still room for improvement, certainly. And here's just these slides. I do not want to delve too long or stay too long on those, because it is just showing that the number of, for example, funds or just assets under management, be it bonds, be it funds, be it equity, everything, it has just been growing extremely quick. And then here we can see, for example, in 2019 and 2020, that is where really this sustainable investing sector has been exploding, literally. So we see the flows have really increased significantly over the last 2 years, and 2021 is again on track to become the most rapid increase, or the largest or the year with the highest inflow to date. And where has the money been flowing? Of course, 2020 with the pandemic, a lot has been flowing into health. Then we see renewable energy, food and agriculture, water and sanitation, and comparatively less has been going into ecosystems and biodiversity. But with a lot of talk recently going around ecosystems and nature in general, I think we will see higher numbers there in the future. And here we just see, again, where has the most of the money been going? Into energy, buildings, transport, waste, water. So that is where fixed income green products have basically been directing their capital. And who has been investing? So sovereigns, of course, but government-backed entities that can be, for example, multilateral development banks, then local governments, finance institutions, corporations, non-financial corporates, loan providers, and then asset-backed security and development banks at the lower end. So this is just to give an overview. And here again, it's just showing the increase. And another group that has been recently been increasing is sustainability-linked loans. So that is where for example, the criteria, the loan criteria have been linked to specific sustainability metrics or indicators. So for example, greenhouse gas emissions reductions or literacy, things like that. So where it's concretely linked and the loan is variable or the interest rate is variable according to how well those metrics are being met or those indicators are being fulfilled. And again, this is just the chunk of all the investment is still concentrated in Europe, not even Middle East or Africa, just Europe. And then we see Asia Pacific is growing, but again, in terms of population numbers or just economic prowess, there's still a lot of improvement. And there's always this argument, why is the money flowing into ESG? And some of the research, and including my research that I showed in the beginning, where you can always consult at the end, the slides, is that ESG and financial performance, there was always this hesitancy, why should we do that? And several studies have shown that ESG integration actually leads to improved financial performance at the corporate, but also at the sovereign levels. And these studies have been confirmed over the time. However, what I also want to show is this narrative is not uniform. So there's also studies, and I do think that is one of the risks why I say there is no ESG, is the risk of greenwashing. So a lot of these funds that we see here is, or a lot of these investing is being said is it's just relabeled as ESG. So a conventional fund just relabels as ESG because of better reputation, more better marketing. And so the thing is that a lot of these funds are merely just ESG in name only. And now we find, if we go look closer, ESG outperformance, or that they actually do outperform or show better performance, might be flawed, because we actually need to look at also the actual ESG characteristics, because just some fund or bond states that they are ESG doesn't mean that they necessarily have any tangible sustainability improvements, because it's not only financial improvements as with the double materiality, it also is, does it actually generate any positive impact on sustainability metrics and indicators? And often that has not been the case. So there have been studies as here also for sustainability funds in Switzerland and Luxembourg, or here retail funds, environmental impact claims, they often do not meet with regulatory requirements. So it's a lot of talk, and whether or not these funds live up to their claims is another question. And greenwashing is one of the main issues around it. So the EU says that greenwashing is the practice of marketing financial products as green or sustainable when in fact they do not meet basic environmental standards. And this is key because we so much hinges on ESG data recently, the growth, the spending from investors has been growing because they want to get the best data to make their investments. But if the data is not good enough, that leads to serious issues, because no one really knows, there's no definition of what actually is green, what activities can be considered green. Everyone can just call their financial product green or ESG. And that is also where these studies previously come to the conclusion that a lot of these funds are actually are just sustainable or ESG in name only. And that is why I said there currently is no ESG to a large extent, because we have not solid enough data, and there's just not good enough reporting by those who issue or who set up these funds and bonds to prove that there's actually, beyond the financial performance, there's actually a tangible sustainability impact that would have not happened otherwise. And again, regulators are now becoming aware of that. And please allow me 1 or 2 more minutes, is this lack of clarity around ESG data, the methodologies that are used to label an to label financial products as green or ESG, they are not clear right now, and that can lead to the risk of greenwashing. And regulators become aware of that, so these risks are now being addressed, and they will probably gain even more prominence in the future, because even if the market says there's a lot of ESG, as we saw this explosion of assets under management, how many of these assets under management would actually still categorize or be able to be categorized as ESG if the strong regulatory standards would be applied? Probably not a lot. So that would mean, in reality, the ESG market is probably much slower. And even in Japan, in Asia, they now become more aware because there's just so much greenwashing been going on, where just because of the market reputation, because something that looks green is always, people feel more connected to it. But because it's so easy to label something as green these days without having any serious repercussions, that is why now regulators and lawmakers are becoming more aware of these issues. And again, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a collection or an initiative by central banks and by financial regulators, they also show that these greenwashing and the lack of data and standardization is leading to serious greenwashing risks. And for example, the EU, they are trying to fight against that by making a lot of these rules mandatory, which is an outlier for most of the world's regulators, because most of them are just voluntary rules right now. But the EU wants to go mandatory, which is a large shift. And they have created something around a EU taxonomy, which is a catalog of what activities can be considered green. And if you are not complying with these, definitions, then you cannot call yourself an ESG fund anymore or green fund. So you do not get that reputational boost anymore, and you cannot engage in misleading communications that you make any claims where there's no data or no proof that you have any tangible sustainability impact. And then the second part is disclosure. So we need to force funds to be much more open and transparent around impacts, and also measure, report, and verify any of the claims that they make. And then also give yourself the tools to be able to implement those. And transition is a large part, and I will go pretty quickly through these slides. It's just that transparency is a major key. And another thing, and I just want to finish it with that, is the EU says, in terms of a taxonomy, you need to contribute to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives that they defined as being aligned with a sustainable future. Then you cannot do any significant harm. That means you cannot, on the one hand, contribute, for example, to carbon or greenhouse gas mitigation, but on the other hand, your activities at the same time produce so much waste and pollute, for example, the ocean so much that any benefits from from greenhouse gas reductions is then negatively offset by the pollution that you create on the other hand. And then you also need to comply with certain minimum safeguards, such as human rights and labor standards. And this is the activities that need to be contributed to: climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, sustainable and protection of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. So if you contribute to one of these 6 objectives, you become eligible to be called green. But then you cannot do any significant harm. So you cannot, again, contribute to climate change mitigation and then do significant harm to any of the other 5. So that would basically disqualify you, again, to call any of your sustainable finance products sustainable. And I will not go too much through that, but again, as I said, transparency and standardized rules and increased regulation will become key cornerstones. And other regulators, such as in the United States, especially with the election of President Biden, are now also going into that direction. And with that, I'm sure there's a lot of questions. So I will looking forward to those because that was a lot of to digest. So I hope some of the questions I can be able to provide some more context.
Sure, and maybe this is a good way to connect to the first segment and kind of the many hats you wear. So throughout that explanation about ESG and sustainable finance, it seems like the field really uses the language of risk and risk management, and that's a particular kind of regulatory approach or way to frame environmental issues, social issues. So I wonder if you think that this is kind of the correct framing, or is it limited in some way? Or I think some would even say, does it represent a kind of financialization of environmental issues? I guess because if you think back to the history of the environmental movement, it was much more kind of grassroots, much more led by kind of, let's say, activists. To now, we kind of have the present form. So I guess I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I do think that, and that is why I also work, for example, with a financial institution where I'm sitting on a lot of these like standard setting or like organizations, because I do believe that the grassroots movements were like extremely instrumental in terms of like framing the narrative and bringing these issues to the forefront, but they cannot exist in that niche anymore because the challenge is just so large and so broad. So what has been formerly existing and being promoted by grassroots movement now needs to become a global movement. It cannot just, and that includes the financial and corporate sectors, because they do not exist in a vacuum either. If you have constantly climate risks, just look at California right now with the fires, where the economy is so disrupted by these constant fires and by these constant environmental risks that at some point it will limit any economic activity that you can carry out. And if I'm a financial institution and I provided loans or I invested in some of these activities or companies, that will ultimately impact my balance sheet and it will impact my returns. So I cannot separate myself. We literally live on this planet, and we cannot separate ourselves from what goes on, either being it physically or biophysically in our environment. So that is why the financial sector, it is both a risk approach, but on the other hand, as I explained with the double materiality, the financial sector also needs to start looking at how are they either contributing or how are they making the situation worse. So that is a very important part. So the financialization of sustainability or of biodiversity or of climate change is actually a necessity, in my opinion, because the financial sector also needs to transition to a much more sustainability aligned mode of operation, where it just becomes natural that ESG factors are taken into consideration, and that, for example, if you decide whether or not to make an investment, or if you manage a portfolio of different companies, or if you decide to make a loan to give out, so that should just become natural, that you both look at the risks, for example, from floods. Right now, Europe has heavy floods, and also Japan recently had some heavy floods. And then at the other time, also, on the other hand, also, for example, droughts, heat waves, things like that. So, and as they become more intense and more frequent, that needs to become natural, because otherwise you are ignoring a lot of risks that will have severe consequences. And on the other hand, you also need to look at how I'm making the situation either worse or better. And that is why greenwashing is such an important part, because what a lot of financial institutions, the risk of a lot of financial institutions and corporations is to make it appear like everything is okay, and then just hope they are the last, they can avoid before before everything crumbles, that they will not be the ones affected. But it's a systemic risk. So climate change and central banks are now becoming aware that if you want growth, and you are the Asian Productivity Organization, so if you want to sustain growth, you cannot have this short-term mentality anymore, because and that is where my science hat becomes very important, is in the end, climate change and biodiversity are physical and biophysical phenomena. We cannot separate ourselves from these elements, from these how do I say it, drivers. And anything that we do at some point will always at some point come back and influence our lives in some way, and also the economy in some way. So looking at these factors is not necessarily, how do I say it, the financialization of environmental issues. It's rather just taking risks that already exist into consideration. And since these risks happen to be environmental, they need to become normalized. They need to become everyday business. And that is rather what I think. So I think the grassroots movement did a fantastic work. They were very instrumental so that these issues come to the forefront. But now it needs to become much more broad.
Right. Thank you. And I'm glad you brought up kind of productivity. And of course, the APO is a productivity organization. Our mission is to promote productivity enhancement. I'm wondering, one of the interesting things that you were talking about in your earlier presentation was the fact that firms that seem to adopt more ESG practices, that's associated with higher firm value, better credit ratings, and better productivity and competitiveness. So I wonder if you could kind of outline so we have the empirical kind of information, although you've also said that maybe there's some space to kind of doubt some of that. But what is the kind of causal story that you would tell that links ESG practice and productivity and competitiveness, for example? And do you think that's all captured by risk management, or are there other elements in play?
Well, risk management needs to consider always different elements and looks at all risks, be it financial risks or what we call non-financial risks. And the thing is, there's always drivers and indicators that indicate whether a company is just properly managed and also is properly handling risk management in terms of by developing strategies. So there's something called the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And they say an organization needs to have proper metrics and targets to measure and to basically set itself some goals. Then it needs to have a proper risk management, and it needs to have a solid strategy to implement that risk management into action. And then it needs to have an overarching governance, for example, the board of directors or any internal quality mechanisms. And good organizations, so those who do acknowledge environmental risks, they are also usually the ones who just generally have better management. But again, that research that I showed prior, one was a study of the University of Hamburg, and the other one was a study of the NYU Stern Business School. And they need to be taken with a grain of salt because they took ESG data pretty much at face value. And the problem is, and that is where future risk management will find a challenge, and that is where expertise and where my hat as a natural scientist will become much more important, is you need to, at future, in order to differentiate between greenwashed environmental impacts and between actual environmental risks and impacts. So, for example, how would someone who gets a bunch of biodiversity data from a company, for example, who is engaged in food-related activities in the Amazon, how would they even be able to interpret biodiversity-related data if they have no prior experience with biodiversity data? And since a lot of people more or less have financial economic backgrounds, that I think is where this interdisciplinarity will become key in the future. And that is where risk management needs to go in the future, is it needs to also diversify and include expertise that might not be the traditional risk management profiles that were present before. Before, it was more about financial risks. Now we need to look at these non-financial risks and the impacts that it has, because the regulators are starting to ask for it. So risk management needs to respond to it, because either the regulators have identified these risks, and because companies or financial institutions were slow to react to it, they are now saying, okay, if you don't want to, we make you consider these risks, or you did it already by yourself. And that is what that is where these studies have merit, I think, is if you already started properly managing those, there has been much less volatility, there has been more solid returns, less fluctuation. And I think that is the key takeaway from these studies, where they still have a very strong exponential value.
Thank you. And you started to mention issues with data, issues with expertise, and the role of science. So I think there's a lot we can get into there. I just want to ask you one question before we maybe move on to the next segment. How do we better bridge the gap between kind of the correct kind of expertise and science and the ESG or sustainable investment industry as it exists today?
That's a key. That's a very good question. It is like one question that I dedicate a lot of time to, because the financial and the corporate sectors are also in their own transition. And of course, you have, whenever there's a transition, that means that there will be winners and there's the risk of having losers. Like those who, for example, have been waiting for a long time for their shot and who have more traditional financial backgrounds, they of course will not be happy if now suddenly there's this movement towards like, yeah, suddenly you have a whole group of people with very different profiles coming in and suddenly having like, yeah, a significant say inside of institutions, of how things are being managed, of how to implement things, of how to just like, yeah, carry out operations on a day-to-day basis. And one of the solutions was like, yeah, what I called, before I showed a small excerpt, competence greenwashing, is that practitioners would just claim overnight, oh, I became a sustainability expert because they did a quick online like ESG course, or they attended a sustainability leadership seminar. Those are not enough. I am someone who always says these courses have their merit because the more awareness there is in the finance and banking and corporate industries around sustainability and ESG, the better. But we should not equate awareness or passion with subject matter expertise. They're not the same. Just because I feel strongly about the climate or I'm very interested in the SDGs doesn't make me automatically a sustainability expert or a climate scientist. They are not the same. And I think that is a realization where I gave the solution. So first of all, we need to do capacity building of existing practitioners. And we need to also acknowledge the limitations. We also need to say, just because you add ESG or sustainability to an existing job title does not change the risk. It actually increases the risk, because some of the risk might not be found out in time. And then when a portfolio crumbles, then there will be a lot of people who lose a lot of money. And so as an investor, I would be very careful, and I would look very closely at the track records and CVs of those who claim to be ESG experts. The second thing is, so besides creating capacity building opportunities for existing practitioners, is to train the future, create a pipeline for future practitioners who are sort of in the middle. And I do not want to make highlight our university, but having, for example, sustainable finance programs, both present at business schools, but also at more technical universities, such as our university, the Institute of Technology, can help, because, for example, my students have mostly natural science background, engineering, science, physics, and now I introduce them to sustainable finance so they can cover that. And then the third one, I think that is the important one, is create diversity in your teams. Create knowledge platforms that allow for what I call cross-pollination, where the exchange of information, where a finance expert with ESG awareness and a non-financial expert, for example, a climate scientist or biodiversity or biologist with some finance experience, can exchange and actually help lift the entire knowledge and expertise of the entire team. So I think those are some of the remedies that I propose.
Great, thank you. I think this is a good time to move on to talking about the implications for Asian countries, which I think will be a lot of interest to our viewers, given our members stretch across the Asia Pacific. So please.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So this is the last segment, and again, also in being not go speedily through it, and then later through your questions also address some of the underlying trends. But again, Asia is growing, but global investors are putting pressure on Asian utilities to cut emissions, because they're still very carbon intensive. And there's often this argument that for Asia to be able to grow and to achieve a standard of life or quality of life similar to those in for example, already heavily industrialized or developed countries, they need to be able to tap into all of the available resources they have at their disposal. And coal still constitutes a large part, but due to the pressures from global investors who want to decarbonize, generally electricity production or manufacturing, some are saying why don't we just what we call leapfrog? Why don't we just forego coal, oil, and gas altogether and jump to renewables, because there have been recent studies that say in most markets, renewables are already cheaper than most fossil fuels. So that is a strong argument, and but the pressure is ramping up. And also what I said before around the greenwashing is, with ESG growing, at the same time, a lot of times Asia is not yet there where it needs to be in terms of transparency, in terms of ESG data availability, and in terms of sustainability data availability. So again, there's this reputational benefit, like where there's a lot of claims being made, because in the past there was almost no ramifications. You could, for example, I wear the SDG pin, and there was a lot of corporate social responsibility around SDGs and sustainability, but there were almost no ramifications for not even following through or not demonstrating actually any tangible impact. But now with the finance sector considering it as an actual financial risk and looking at how can we reduce our impacts, our negative impacts on the environment, on the climate, because we actually make our own situation worse if we do not consider these things. Now, regulators also become much more aware, and recently some funds have been identified to have to revise their statements or any claims they made in their funds around ESG, because sometimes there was just not enough, the methodologies were not clear, or the metrics were not clear of how are we actually going to measure, disclose, and verify any of these promises that we make in terms of ESG benefits. So the regulators are becoming more aware of that. And for example, also the investors, if you want capital in the future, because even those investors that are based in countries where you would say coal is still very relevant, they also see the writings on the wall, and they also see if there's risks that, for example, coal or so will at some point be phased out. Even if we don't want that, it will still happen, and it will make coal unviable because it just becomes comparatively so expensive, because the market has become so small, so that anyone who extracts coal and wants to sell it doesn't find a lot of buyers anymore. So it might make some operations unviable in the long term or in the medium term. So that might also make coal power stations or so very reduce the profits, and therefore also make these investments not competitive anymore. So there's a lot of these things, and some reports have shown that Asia needs to, or Asian jurisdictions need to do definitely more in terms of banking, and also in terms of their net zero commitments moving towards, for example, carbon neutrality. There's a lot of claims being made, but often the implementation and the actions still do not match any of the ambitions. So that is very important to bear in mind. So in terms of regulation, we also see now Asian jurisdictions ramping up their efforts. And we see here, for example, the EU and the UK still, because the UK is still, for a large part, for their sustainable finance regulations, was still in the EU when a lot of these were made. So we see a lot of identical ambitions there. And then you can see the EU and Europe in general are now really leading. And that is not because there's any policy gain to make from it. They just see it as a potential opportunity to lower their own risks, but also generate the innovation necessary to how do I say it, to sustain their economies in the long time and to basically maintain growth in the future. And we see other jurisdictions like China, but also for example, Hong Kong, China, Singapore, Japan, they are all moving in the same directions by trying to expand the number of initiatives and tools and instruments they give themselves in order to manage these risks and foster sustainability. And we can see here, for example, investors also are starting to become more aware of these issues. They still, many of them have not fully started to implement some of these rules or ambitions, policies, but there's an increasing awareness. So for example, in terms of ESG issues, they say many of them are much more aware that in the future they will impact share prices or yields, or sovereign debt yields. So even countries who want to issue sovereign debt, they will be measured against their ESG performance. And if, for example, we go, for example, Indonesia and Malaysia, deforestation is a very large issue there, and forest fires, because the changing environment. And those are issues that investors take into account, because what we see in California now, that can become very real in the very near future, for example, in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. So we see those things play out already in real time. And investors, of course, see that as a significant risk, but also as significant reputational issues, because if you are constantly shown not to do anything, and if all your promises are shown to be merely that, just empty promises, that will have concrete impacts on how well investors see whether or not you are still represent a good investment. So in terms of taxonomies, like we saw the EU basically creating this taxonomy that certain activities or environmental objectives are inherently green. And other countries are now also moving into that direction. So we see, for example, the EU taxonomy, but China and Japan also have been moving in similar directions. So we see in Asia it expanding. So, for example, here the Kingdom of Thailand has created a rule, and they, for example, went the other route, like exclusion. So they said certain activities are always considered incompatible with anything that is related to sustainable finance. For example, exploration, production of transportation of fossil fuel, large-scale hydropower plants, generation of nuclear power, biomass plants, manufacture and production of finished alcoholic beverages, lethal defense goods. So that doesn't mean that any financial products that are involved in these activities cannot be marketed anymore. The only thing is they cannot be marketed as sustainable. That is the important difference. And it's the same with the EU taxonomy. You can still market whatever you want, just you cannot call it green or sustainable. That is the important part. China has also been moving in a similar direction by also collaborating with the EU on the taxonomy. And for example, recently in their catalog, what has been cut? Large supercritical coal power plants, which were previously included in energy saving projects that process coal to remove impurities, ventures that produce fuels and additives, including gasoline and diesel with higher environmental standards. And then what has been added, more clean energy projects, a new category on green services, infrastructure supporting new energy vehicles. So those are all activities that are considered green. Then Malaysia also went and created their own taxonomy, very similar to the EU. And then Malaysia is also now setting up the structures to have their own taxonomy. And Japan also created an expert group to work out an taxonomy. So also sort of like a guidebook, which comprises some mandatory regulations of what is considered green and what not. And I will not go too much into the details, but yeah, they said for example, institutional investors, they need to have full knowledge, better data, then they need to have support and better risk management, and of course some mandatory oversight, which is a very large improvement, because previously it was mostly just voluntary. And other countries also move, like Japan, into what they call a transition taxonomy. So the EU excludes coal and oil and gas activities just right out the gate. But Japan says that is not really viable for us. And some other countries have been going a similar route, where they said, we still need to be able to have some oil and gas or fossil fuel-based activities. And we do not want to isolate them and cut them off from capital markets. So they are now developing a transition taxonomy. So to say, if you still engage in coal, but if you fulfill certain reductions, for example, if you halve your carbon footprint or you use the latest technology, you would still be able to call yourself, for example, sustainable transition. And that is up to Japan to decide. But in the EU, if you would be a Japanese corporate or financial institution and you would want to market that fund in Europe, you would not be able to call it sustainable, because it would be excluded because you still have coal or gas inside. So different countries are looking for different solutions. And here's, for example, these basic guidelines on transition finance, where they say, so you have green under the EU, that would then fall under the taxonomy, under their taxonomy. And then you have transition bonds and loans. And what they want is sort of help that market, because they feel that a lot of their companies or their economy is not decarbonized enough yet to just move away to fully renewable systems in the near future. So they don't want to cut off these, and they don't want to have the reputational stigma attached to these activities, so that it's either green or not green. Japan wants to create a third category that is sort of like in the middle. And in an article that I wrote, Sustainable Finance in Japan, it's just Japan has been ramping up, and most of it has been voluntary, but they're trying to improve the policy. And for example, supporters of the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, they have a lot of supporters, but also what our paper found is support doesn't necessarily mean action. So for example, if we look at the principles for responsible investing, which are much more strict and also have some mandatory requirements. So if you want to be called a PRI signatory, you need to fulfill certain disclosure requirements. There we see the number of Japanese signatories much lower, as the TCFD has almost no you can support, and there's no penalty mechanism if you do not report in accordance with the TCFD. And for the science-based targets initiatives, which basically means you set a target for basically becoming carbon neutral by a certain date, usually 2030 or 2050. Japanese companies are also still comparatively underperforming in relation to their representation in the most polluting companies in the world. So there's still also a lot of room for improvement to basically set tangible and verifiable carbon reduction targets. And in terms of disclosure, they are doing pretty well, but the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, only says how much are Japanese companies disclosing, not necessarily how good is the quality or how well are they actually doing in terms of their sustainability score. It's just how much are they disclosing under the framework of the Carbon Disclosure Project. And we see that in Japan, most of the green investing flows into energy and buildings, and then transportation as well. But what we can say is the amount of green bonds has been exploding. But the question is, what I also mentioned in the beginning, is it needs to be very heavily scrutinized and much more explored in detail. Are these bonds or these financial products actually green, or are they just relabeled as green? So, and 2020 is also now on track to become the year with the so far highest amount of issuance. But again, it remains to be seen how good the quality is of these financial products, because that is one of the problems with financial sustainable finance. It often takes years to show that a product merely was just making a lot of claims on paper, and in action, it had very limited positive impacts. So, but we see Japanese companies are expanding their goals, and activists are still active, because Japanese banks, there's still a back and forth, a lot of pushback against these sustainability trends. But the regulators say that more disclosure is needed in order to foster sustainability, and with more liability for directors of not considering these risks, that can also be in the future one of the emerging risks. And large investors like the Government Pension Investment Fund, the largest institutional investor in the world, they first were embracing ESG, but recently, since they also are linked to more traditional returns, they also now have cooled on ESG investing. So in Japan, we can see a little bit the dilemma of Asia. It is still sort of caught in between, the pressures from outside, the global trends, especially in developed countries, versus, of course, Japan is a developed country, but also those who are very heavily reliant on carbon-intensive sectors. So how to shift away, that is still a large dilemma. But we can see, for example, also the GPF, they're now considering ESG factors in their strategic investment principles. So we can see that there is this move, because the risks are also have become very tangible. For example, here we see an analysis by the GPIF, the Government Pension Investment Fund, who identified energy, materials, and utilities as those most exposed to climate risks. So that was it from me. I know that was a quick summary of the situation in Asia overall and in Japan as a case study. And I'm looking forward to some of the final questions to provide a little bit of additional context.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Schumacher. So maybe we can begin, since you kind of explained some of the early movement in Asia Pacific around ESG, around kind of adapting to some of these practices in sustainable banking, sustainable finance. Uh, we kind of saw from your earlier segment how, in terms of the actual investment, EU is still leading other regions by quite a large amount. Uh, do you think there's a potential for are Asian countries kind of, because you also mentioned some of the mistakes or kind of issues that they're facing right now, are Asian countries kind of doomed to repeat some of these early mistakes of EU countries in approaching ESG regulations, or is there an opportunity to do it better, to perhaps leapfrog kind of some of these earlier issues?
To say it bluntly, yes. I think Asia has a unique opportunity to leapfrog and basically not repeat the sins of the past. And because the technology is there, and for example, economies like China, but also in Japan and Singapore, other countries, Thailand, uh, they have Vietnam as well. They have a lot of the manufacturing and technological, like how do I say it, instruments and tools and potential to basically implement all of these things. Now it's just a question of, are they able to seize it? And it is always like, yeah, I know there's always different stakeholder interests at play, and there always needs to be a dialogue of how, what is the best way forward. But really, a short answer, yes, there's the opportunity to leapfrog. So in Europe, like a lot of the wealth also stems from past unsustainable behavior, like yeah, where the industrialization and also post World War II, a lot of the growth was unsustainable growth in terms of resource use. So and now I do also think it should also be developed countries who take the first step to reduce their carbon footprints and reduce their resource use in order to like yeah have a fairer distribution of resources, but also fair distributions of the burdens of shifting to a low carbon or a more sustainable economic models. So yes, Asia has all the ingredients at its disposal to at least avoid some of the mistakes. Some might be bound to be repeated, but the potential is definitely there to avoid the worst, especially in terms of electric power generation, because Asia is also one of the countries where which will most heavily suffer from climate change. And for example, the demand for cooling will explode in the near future. So the energy demand as well. And we see already, like for example, in Malaysia and Indonesia, with the deforestation and with the expansion of palm oil, for example, it changes biophysical, like or the biosphere, the regional biosphere. So with palm oil, like basically wetlands are being dried out, and that changes local climates, and that makes forest fires and large droughts much more common in areas that were never experiencing that before. And then, for example, you have cities like Jakarta or like Bangkok, which are at severe risk of like sea level rise. And those are all issues that will have severe consequences. And in order to become more resilient, but also try to limit global warming to some extent, that is definitely the way to go. Because, of course, there's the historical responsibility where developed countries, due to unsustainable economic models in the past, basically gained a lot of of their current wealth through usage of their own resources or an unsustainable use of natural resources. But that should not prevent Asia to basically also lead, because we see it already, like with in terms of having access to certain technologies and also now access to the necessary expertise, the local expertise. They can literally jump ahead of developed nations by becoming sustainability leaders, and by basically because one of the research that I did in the past was around ESG integration and macroeconomic growth, and we found ESG integration is especially powerful in emerging and developing nations, because they do not have to replace any existing old stocks. So they can just start building a sustainable infrastructure from the start. They can already, in terms of urbanism, already build urban cities, sustainable cities that do not repeat the mistakes of the past. So there's a lot of potential there.
Right, that's a lot to consider. Maybe I would want to return to talking about some of the issues with data that you alluded to earlier. So maybe I can get straight to the point. What are the major issues with data when it comes to ESG? I know one, maybe some people say that there's a reliance, perhaps an over-reliance on corporate disclosure.
Definitely. So to a quick answer, yes. There's most of our data currently is either self-reported or self-assessed. So be it corporate questionnaires, be it sustainability reports, annual reports, be it industry reports, industry group reports, almost everything that we have, even news reports like the Financial Times or Reuters, they are mostly just reproducing like announcements by companies. So most of our information comes from the companies directly. And the problem is the regulation has not kept pace with the increasing complexity in terms of sustainability and environmental impacts. So again, a financial regulator will not necessarily look at water-related issues or at biodiversity-related issues, or for example, at carbon emissions. They are not trained to do that. They were trained to look at financial irregularities. And the problem is nowadays, there's no one really overseeing any sustainability related data that is being reported. So since there's not enough oversight, we need to take the data to a large extent at face value. But what we also find is a lot of data gaps. So like sometimes it's not reported, or you only report a part of your supply chain. So you're not even measuring, not monitoring, because there's almost no penalty mechanisms right now. Markets do not necessarily penalize the absence of reliable sustainability data. So that leads to such large gaps that it's almost impossible to, to properly know the actual impact of companies. But what we can do in the meantime to remedy is look at certain indicators. So there's always indicators that illustrate whether a company might be engaged in unsustainable behavior or not. So for example, there's the amount and the quality of reporting. Usually where there's smoke, there's fire. That is what we have found in ESG. Usually those companies that are very reluctant to disclose, for example, Volkswagen with the diesel scandal. So usually where there's smoke, there's fire. And then the second thing is, for example, look at certain indicators. For example, gender equality, those are very powerful indicators to indicate whether a company is even willing to, to radically change its internal operational structures. And usually if that is not at display, especially at the levels of power, then usually that also means that they engage in business as usual in many other operational and, for example, investment level activities. So, and we found some studies have found very strong links between bad performance, for example, in terms of diversity, and bad environmental performance, because if you just have the same people always, the decision making will not necessarily radically change. So those are definitely indicators. They are not adequate replacements for lack of data, but they at least can identify those companies where we should have a much closer look. And it also comes to the expertise. That will become a very important proxy in the future, where you look at expertise for ESG issues and how many people they actually have in their ranks. So for example, there was a recent study again by NYU around the material ESG expertise of boards among, I think, Forbes 500 companies. And they found that only, 1% of them had environmental expertise in the boards. And sometimes even those who are managing energy companies, they had very little knowledge of renewable energy or energy issues in general. So often you have people who basically just have management and business expertise, but not really the material expertise around what are their companies actually how are they operating and what are the risks, the non-financial risks that these companies are exposed to. So those are significant gaps, but they can serve as indicators of how good the company is actually doing, and what also could explain significant data gaps. So, and then we know we need to engage these companies and we need to get data from them. And if we do not get the data, then it might be a good signal to say we might want to lower our exposure to these potential risks, because that company is simply not being transparent enough. And there might be very significant risks in the future, for example, to assets that are under their management.
Right. I'm a little mindful of your time, so maybe one more substantive question. What about, so it seems to me that ESG is really about largely like publicly listed companies, larger companies that can kind of afford to do all this disclosure, do this kind of sustainability reporting. But across the APO member economies, most of the economy is composed of small and medium enterprises. So is there a role that ESG can play for these firms, for these smaller companies? Or is it kind of just the domain of the big companies in each country?
There's two things, and that's a good question. It's a very good question that I've also wondered, because you have one of the metrics that is being used for greenhouse gas emissions is what we call scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for greenhouse gas, for carbon. And scope 1 works like the thing that those are the emissions that the company produces directly through its own activities. For example, a logistics company through their transportation activities. Then you have what we call scope 2 is through the purchase of electricity or heat. So, for example, a company like Cisco, who has a lot of servers, that would be a large portion for them, like because they buy a lot of electricity to entertain their servers. And then you have what we call scope 3. That is all the rest. That is literally everything that is upstream or downstream in their supply chain. Be it, for example, from material sourcing to what happens with my products once I sold them. So, example, for oil and gas companies downstream, that is a very important part. So once they sold you the gasoline, what happens with that and how is it being used? Usually it's burned in an internal combustion engine, and that would still account towards their scope 3 emissions. So there's a lot of things that fall into that. And the one company's scope 1 emissions are another company's scope 3 emissions. So if I'm, for example, a large apparel company and I source things from a small or medium enterprise, those might be that company. So, for example, the bleaching activities or the coloring activities might be that company's scope 1 emissions. But it would be, for example, a large apparel company's scope 3 emissions. So, and it also comes back to materiality. So there was a study that said that only 100 companies are responsible for 80% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So it always depends on, what do we consider material? And I think we should not exclude small and medium enterprise companies, but I think the lever is the large companies, because if they are forced to engage in better disclosure, they will also force their suppliers to give them better data. So, example, if you have a large company that, for example, engages in timber products, and they often say, oh, we have some certificates that say it's from sustainable sources, but that often comes from very questionable authorities. And the thing is, once we force them and say, you need to actually follow these specific guidelines, just having a certificate stamped by government authority X, Y, or Z is not enough anymore. Then that company gets pressure to basically say, we need better data from our suppliers. It's not enough anymore. So, and then that would be the final thing where I do agree is then we need to also provide tools for small and medium enterprise companies to basically balance out sometimes the lack of resources, for especially human resources that they have to systematically collect that data. So, and that's an important question. There's definitely, for example, in terms of digital or AI-based solutions that are now being developed to help small and medium enterprises to have access to some of these tools that they might not have that larger ones have. But larger ones, since they are sourcing, they also need to be part of the solutions to provide these tools to their suppliers. So that will be an important case. So I think in terms of materiality and in terms of levers, I think it's more important to engage the large ones right now, because they are often sourcing their materials from small and medium enterprises. So I think that would be the solution. But of course, there also needs to be tools available for these small and medium enterprises then to collect the data that is being asked of them.
All right, thank you. So just final quick question for people who are interested in learning more about ESG and sustainable finance, what resources, people, or organizations would you point them to?
I think some very good resources are produced by the OECD. Then other very good ones are the Principles for Responsible Investing. Then the UNEP Finance Initiative has a lot of resources. And then, of course, all the academic institutions, such as the Turkey Institute of Technology, they would be good places. And that is one that I found for myself, is people should become actively involved in social networks. And I do not want to highlight a specific one, but let's call it a more business-oriented social network, where I didn't have an account like 1.5 years ago, like not at all. And then I found that is a fantastic resource to engage with the people who are actually working in these sectors, because often these are the very people who produce these reports and that research. And then you get it straight from the source. And then, of course, organizations like the APO, of course, hopefully in the future, will be part of the sources where people go to learn more about these types of topics. Because if you talk growth, if you talk economics, then in the future you cannot dissociate it anymore from sustainability.
Great. So I think we're at the end of our session. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. I'd like to thank Dr. Schumacher for sharing his time and knowledge with us. I think you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you to our viewers for giving us your time today as well. We look forward to seeing you at our next productivity talk. To get updated, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. I hope everyone stays safe, happy, and productive. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me again.